Alright, so here's the first of three short little videos on sauropsids. This one's going to focus on our turtles. Turtles are really neat. There's lots of things we still don't really know about them. Certainly their relationship to other sauropsids is still a bit of a mystery. So today in this short lecture we're going to focus on first going through the phylogenetic tree of sauropsids. We're going to focus on turtles here, but this is going to be an introduction to the next two lectures as well a wee bit. Then we'll get into the general description of what turtles are, go through the ancestral turtles, give you the characteristics of what a turtle is and how it differentiates from the other sauropsids, and we'll wrap it up with the two major groups of turtles and give you some examples of what turtles are like in Canada. This is the phylogenetic tree for sauropsids. Let's start with the outgroup, amphibians. Amphibians are not amniotes, so everything else we're talking about in this course are amniotes. And that means they have an amniotic egg, which we've already discussed. They also have coastal lung ventilation, so they're using their ribs to breathe, and they have keratinized skin. Sauropsids also have beta-carotene in their skin and the ability to excrete uric acid, and they have a lung that's different than ours. It's a favular lung, and we'll explain that in the next lecture. We are going to be talking about turtles today, and they have basically quite a mysterious place on the phylogenetic tree. Morphological evidence has placed them in a variety of places, and it's moved forward and backwards several times just in the last 20 years. There's morphological evidence that makes them pretty basal in the phylogenetic tree, like it occurs early, before the diversification of lizards and snakes. However, genetic evidence suggests that they're somewhere more closely related to crocodiles. Maybe a sister group with crocodiles, and then turtles and crocodiles would be the sister group for birds. If you combine morphological evidence and molecular evidence, that certainly seems to be the most supported place for them, although it might be better to place them basically basal to crocodiles and leave crocodiles and birds as archosaurs and have turtles as basically not archosaurs but still in the diapsid group, because that basically is the major difference, is that the molecular evidence firmly makes turtles diapsids. And that's surprising because their skull, if you were to look at a modern turtle, their skulls are anapsids. So if you look to the left of the slide here, you can see A is an anapsid skull, but molecular evidence says they should be diapsids, which has basically these two holes in their skull, or basically temporal openings. So that's been confounding historically, and I think we're getting close to knowing where they should be, but it's still not totally resolved. So turtles are amniotes, they're sauropsids, they're now firmly in the diapsid category. We're not sure if they're archosaurs or not, but we're getting close to knowing that. The next lectures are going to focus on lizards and snakes, and those are known as squamates. So getting deeper into what a turtle is, so we already pointed out that they have this anapsid skull, sort of, like molecularly it's a diapsid skull, but physically it looks like an anapsid skull. Turtles are also ectothermic, and they lay eggs, which essentially require no parental care. They don't use any parental care. Those are characteristics that are shared with other squamates, so I'm going to get into those in a future lecture. things that differentiate or distinguish turtles from squamates, the other sauropsids, be typically that they're quite long-lived and they have very slow population growth. They have a three-chambered heart, similar to that of the amphibian, but it's semi-partitioned. Some of them have cutinous respiration, but most don't. Most breathe exclusively through their lungs. Turtles have shells, including a plastron, which like no other vertebrates have, and how the shell formed has been a bit of a mystery for a while as well. They don't have teeth, they have a horny beak. The muscles that control their mouth, the jaw adductor muscles, bend posteriorly over the otic capsule, which is part of the inner ear. And at least one group of turtles have what's called a trochlear process, which is essentially a pulley system that basically gives their jaw more power. And then the pelvic and pectoral girdles are inside the ribs, which also is derived. No other sauropsids have this characteristic. So all around, very unique organisms, maybe one of the most derived vertebrates that we have. It's interesting to think about how, if turtles were extinct and we were just finding the shells of these organisms, they would be really, really cool. Right up there with, nifty dinosaurs. However, because they're still around, somehow they've kind of come to be seen as commonplace. But I still think they're really, really neat. And I hope that as we get into some of the adaptations that turtles have, you'll see just how cool they are. For years, the placing turtles on the phylogenetic tree was complicated by the fact that we just didn't have a good ancestral turtle. We didn't have good fossil turtles. And there's some cool ones, but none that went back far enough that showed that clear connection to an early tetrapod. And then in 2015, Popcelli's was found in Germany, and this really started to change things. It had ribs that were expanded, but not yet a shell, and it didn't have those dermal scutes, which we're going to get into later, but it had a skull, that reptile face, lots of vertebrae, 4 legs with hinged ankle bones. The thing that really was important about Popcelli's was that it had a diapsid skull, which really cleared things up. We had the ancestor that had an anatomical characteristic that matched the molecular evidence. So that was great to find. And this goes all the way back to the mid-Triassic, so we're talking 225 million years ago. So that's the most ancient turtle that we have, and it's that missing link that connects turtles to other tetrapods. In 2008, we had found Odontocheles, which was in China, and it lived later, so closer to present day, rather, than Popcelli's. So it was around in the late Triassic, which I see is spelt wrong there. I'll have to fix that. And it had some things that made it different than modern day turtles. So it still had simple teeth, did not have a beak. And it has a plastron, that shell on the bottom, but no carapace. It didn't have the shell on the bottom, or on the top. And that's really neat. So we're showing a gradation towards modern turtles. The gastralia on Popcelli's is there, and it's basically developing the plastron, and no carapace is apparent. The next fossil we have, that plastron is developed, but still no carapace. So we're moving towards modern turtles, and that's a really neat graduation that we're seeing in the fossil record. So the fossil record is starting to line up with molecular evidence about the development of turtles and where they fit in the phylogenetic tree. Um, what is starting to develop, what are starting to appear, is the turtle shell. It's really cool to consider that the plastron, the lower part of the shell, and the carapace, the dorsal carapace, developed independently. Uh, so these two like basically plates of armor that cover the turtle developed separately. So the dorsal carapace has two main parts. There's this bony endochondral skeleton that's covered with broad keratinous scales. And these two parts don't match up perfectly. So there are essentially 59 elements of bone that make up the dorsal carapace. And they, as it's developing, basically spread radially from 59 centers. So, and this is in the skin, and it ossifies with the ribs and the vertebrae, making a total shell. And then there are these keratinous scales that overlap that, but basically they don't line up. And you can see this in the picture there. On the right-hand side are the bony plates, and then on the left-hand side of the picture of this snapping turtle, you can see where the keratinous scales are. Then the ventral plastron is also formed by dermal ossification. It's essentially formed from three bones. It's derived from three different bones. The epiplastron is at the front, and that's basically like fused clavicles. And then there's the entoplastron, and that's the interclavicle. And then everything else below that are basically just expanded gastralia. So this ventral plastron is pretty neat because it, in many turtles, is also hinged, and the hinges can occur in different places in the plastron, but most of these hinges occur at the front and the back, and allow for basically the plastron to hinge forward, so that when the turtle draws in its appendages and draws in its head and tail, it's able to close up and protect itself. Now, some turtle shells lack this dermal ossification, and they lack the epidermal scutes even. They still have shell elements, but they're covered in a layer of skin. These would be the soft shells, and I'll show you some pictures of those later. So that's the turtle shell. So to go a little deeper into this, so we've just talked about the bony protective layer, the shell, the carapace, and the plastron. Now let's get into some of the structural things in the head and the body. So the turtle skull is unique as well. They have they lost their teeth, and now they have what's called a rhamphotheca. It's essentially a keratinous beak that's pretty different from their ancestral state, so that's a derived trait. It looks like they have an anapsid skull, so they've lost one of those temporal fenestra. And then the muscle that controls the jaw swings up over the otic capsule and then runs posteriorly to the body, so towards the back of the body. And that, because it hinges up over that otic capsule, the otic capsule actually acts like a pulley and gives the jaw more bite, more strength. In pleurodires, I'm going to get into what those are later, not only do they, bring this adductor muscle up over the otic capsule, they have a special, basically ridge that is called the trochlear process that enhances that power, that process, that contraction, makes their bite even more powerful. If we look internally, so if you were to take the plastron off and look inside the turtle at their vertebrae, you'd see that they have 8 cervical vertebrae, and between these vertebrae they have these things called ginglimia, if I can say that properly, which basically permit the vertebrae to bend in such a way that the turtle can draw its head into its shell. It permits that S-shape bending that allows them to hide their head. They have 10 vertebrae that have fused with the carapace. And then in cryptodires, they have 2 sacral vertebrae that the pelvic girdle attaches to. In pleurodires, the pelvis itself is fused to both the top shell, the carapace, and the plastron. So those are all characteristics of a turtle that are derived. All right, so on this slide I just wanted to go over the turtle's heart. It's very similar to that of the amphibian, with one major refinement. They have this muscular ridge that basically directs traffic. It controls the flow of blood and essentially prevents the mixing of deoxygenated blood with oxygenated blood. This muscular ridge can move and basically direct traffic. It's pretty, basically it acts like a shunt, and this can be pretty useful for an organism that hibernates and buries itself in the mud for 8 months of the year. And it's also important for an organism that dives and needs to hold its breath for significant periods of time. It essentially allows the turtle to use oxygen more efficiently. What you can see here in A is as the atria contract, oxygenated blood from the atrium, the left atrium, enters the cavum arteriosum, and deoxygenated blood from the right atrium first enters the cavum venosum, and then crosses the muscular ridge and enters the cavum pulmonaris, or pulmona. The atrioventricular valve blocks the intraventricular canal and prevents mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. In B, we can see what happens when the ventricle contracts. The deoxygenated blood in the cavum pulmonale is expelled through the pulmonary arteries. The atrioventricular valve closes and it no longer obstructs the intraventricular canal, and the oxygenated blood in the cavum arteriosum is forced into the cavum venosum and expelled through the right and left aortic arches. The adpression of the wall of the ventricle to the muscular ridge prevents mixing of deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood. The thing that regulates this relatively complex process in the heart is pressure, and essentially the pressure can be modified by constricting muscles in the pulmonary circuit, and this will balance out the pressure in the 2 circuits, and blood can basically mix in the heart. Oxygenated and deoxygenated blood can mix, and that basically that muscular ridge is no longer preventing the movement of blood between the 2 parts of the heart, and it acts as a shunt. And the point of this in an organism like a turtle that holds its breath sometimes for long periods of time is essentially efficiency. It's allowing the most efficient use of oxygen in its system. I think that the anatomical feature of turtles that I find the most interesting is not the fact that they can pull on their heads and their tails and that their plastron can hinge and they can use that for protection, or that they have this carapace, this hard carapace to protect them from predation. That's all cool, but I think the thing that really amazes me about turtles is their respiration. All of their near relatives basically use the movement of their ribs to control the action of their lungs, to inhale and exhale air. But in turtles, their ribs have been fused with their carapace, so they can't do that. In fact, they've lost the intercostal muscles that would do this. So how do they breathe? How do they control their lungs? And essentially they have, it's a four-part system. There's four muscles and the posterior limiting membrane that regulates this. And essentially to exhale, rather, the turtle flexes the transverse abdominis and pectoralis muscles, which pull the posterior limiting membrane forward, and it compresses the viscera, so like the organs, the guts of the turtle, up against its lungs and forces the carbon dioxide-rich air out of their lungs. And then to inhale, gravity helps a little bit, but basically the turtle flexes the abdominal oblique and serratus muscles, which pull the viscera back down, and here's where the gravity helps a little bit, and this draws oxygen back into the lungs. What this means, though, is that for every part of its respiration, turtles need to flex a muscle. Now, there are some turtles that are able to diffuse oxygen directly through their skin. This can happen either in the cloaca or the pharynx. And it can be as much as 10% of their oxygen needs can be dissolved directly through the skin in this fashion. But that's certainly not a trait that you find in all turtles. Mostly it's turtles that are predominantly aquatic. An interesting example of this would be the common snapping turtle here in North America. Somewhere between 3 and 10% of their oxygen demands, especially when they're hibernating at the bottom of a pond, typically buried in the mud, is through diffusion of oxygen through their cloaca. So, turtle reproduction, that's next, and it's relatively straightforward. The male turtle will mount the female turtle, and he applies his cloaca to her cloaca and provides sperm, and they have internal fertilization. And then the female will lay eggs, and once those eggs are buried, typically they bury their eggs in dirt or sand, the female leaves, and there's zero parental care. That's pretty much where the story stops. Where amphibians show this huge variation in their reproductive strategies and the degree of parental care they will put into their offspring, turtles don't. They all pretty much do the one thing, and it's all pretty minimal. But the story does get a little more complicated when you think about what happens next. So the female turtle has typically buried these eggs in a beach somewhere or in sandy sediment near a pond. And where she places those eggs is a big deal because moisture and temperature now play a big role in what happens to those young. When she places her nest in a place that has sufficient water, the young typically develop well, they develop faster, and they get larger. And typically, those young are better at surviving, so they have a higher survivorship once they've hatched. So picking the right place with the right amount of moisture is pretty important for offspring survival. Temperature, pretty much for all turtles, determines sex. So temperature-dependent sex determination, TSD, is pretty much universal in all turtles. And as little as a 3 or 4 degree Celsius difference can determine the sex of a turtle, a young turtle. Most turtles in a nest will end up being the same sex, but in a beach, you will have multiple nests, and some nests will be mostly male, and some nests will mostly be female. And usually there's a mix of male and female offspring produced from a beach every year. Sadly, survivorship for these offspring is typically very low. And it's driven largely by predation, nest predation. So there's lots of animals that will depredate these nests, and even when the young hatch, if the nest survives and doesn't get depredated before the young hatch, the hatchlings still have a sort of a gauntlet of predation to get through before they can find refuge in the water. And even once they're in the water, there are predators there that are eager to eat them up. So while an adult has this hard shell, bony shell, it makes them pretty tough to consume. The offspring are not nearly so tough yet, and many of them are like bite size. They're easy to consume whole. So there's quite a bit of depredation, and like juvenile mortality is by far the most sensitive life stage for turtles. But if they can get past that and mature, which typically takes a long time, like even something as common as the painted turtle around here takes 7 to 8 years before they're old enough to mate. But once they're reproductive, they can have a long, long time to have offspring. And it's not unusual for a turtle to live as long as a human or longer. And certainly some of our larger turtles, the leatherbacks and the giant tortoises, can live upwards of 100 years, maybe even 150 to 170 years. So they have many, many opportunities to reproduce and replace themselves. So even though nest depredation and high juvenile mortality is the norm, they have the opportunity to replace themselves many times over. However, this this complicated and sensitive life stage does make conserving turtles quite a bit of a challenge. So this slide just shows you the major families of turtles found around the world. There's only 320 to 330 species of turtles worldwide. It's hard to find an exact number on how many are at risk, but it's estimated that at least half of them are threatened with extinction. That makes them, as a group, one of the most threatened on this planet, right up there with amphibians. It may be worse, really, for turtles than amphibians. Just we don't have a lot of information about the status for some of these turtles. But here, are a few examples. Like sea turtles are every type of sea turtle on this planet is listed as either threatened or endangered. So that entire group, that entire family, is at risk. And then of the tortoises, all of the giant tortoises are at some degree of risk. Not all of them are threatened, but many of them are. So the giant tortoise is another very unique and iconic turtle at high conservation risk. In Canada, we only have 8 types of turtle, and 7 of the 8 species are listed as threatened, if not endangered. So it's pretty clear that turtles are unique. They're also there's not very many of them, and the ones that we have, many of them are at serious conservation risk. So this is a pretty important group of organisms. I'm not going to go through all the different families here. I would like you to read this slide, though, and make yourself familiar with the different groups and how many species there are in each group and what essentially divides them, what makes them different from the others. I will, in a future slide, get into the families of turtles that we have in Canada, and I'll give you more detail about them. So first, broadly, turtles can be divided into 2 groups. There's the cryptodires and the pleurodires. The cryptodires are probably the turtle you are familiar with. These are the ones that can pull their head into their shell typically. To do this, they're vertically compressing their neck in that S shape. Most of the turtles that we have in North America are all cryptodires, and it includes everything from painted turtle, all sea turtles, and the leatherback turtle. The pleurodires are neat. If you've never seen one of these, you should Google it or look it up on the web. These are side-necked turtles, so they also can retract their head into their shell, but they do it sideways. You typically don't find pleurodires in northern, in the temperate zone, northern temperate zone, but they are fairly common in equatorial regions and farther south. Major things that divide the pleurodires from the cryptodires would be that their pelvis is fused to the carapace and the plastron, so it's fused both top and bottom. And they have this special trochlear process, which is that thing, that pulley-like thing that guides the muscle that they use to contract their jaw. And they are, by and large, aquatic. There might be one or two examples that are, more terrestrial, but they're mostly aquatic. And mostly you're going to find them in South America, Africa, and Australia. So those are the two major groups or divisions in turtles. All right, so here are the turtles of Canada. Let's start with the one everybody loves, the common snapping turtle. This is our only member of Chelydrididae, and this is one of, I think, 6 species of snapping turtle on the planet. The other one that you might find in North America is the alligator snapping turtle, which is just basically a common snapping turtle times 10, just bigger and more archaic looking. But they typically have that scalloped, large, heavy shell with the big, pronounced ridges. They have large, like wicked-looking beak. They can't quite pull their head all the way in, and they're just big and heavy. Those are the common snapping turtles. The other group many of us will be probably familiar with is the Emidididae, and this is by far the most common group in Canada. It includes things like the one we've pictured here, the map turtle, but it's also the painted turtle, the wood turtle, the Blandings turtle, western pond turtle, spotted turtle, and eastern box turtle. And they're, basically what you consider your classic turtle with, these are cryptodires, so they can pull their head in to their shell using that sort of S-shape, vertical S shape. They can pull their legs in, they can pull their tail in, but typically their shell isn't hinged. They're mostly aquatic, but they do come onto land to lay their eggs, obviously. Then the other one is the Trinidae. This is a spiny soft shell. These guys don't have that ossified dermal bone in their shell, and both their carapace and their plastron are covered with skin, hence that sort of soft shelled appearance. They're pretty neat, but they're also at risk. There's not many of them left. Then there's the Cynosternidae, and this is the stink pot. They're adorable little things, and kind of suffer with a bit of a bad name. So they do stink, but what's neat about these guys is that they're the ones around here with the hinged shell. So they can pull in their appendages, and they can hinge up their shell and have that added protection. The last two groups, the Chelonidae and the Dermochilidae, are sea turtles. And there's in the Chelonidae group, we've got our Ridleys and our green sea turtles. And they have that elongated shell and the obvious flippers, and they're unable to bring their head all the way into their carapace, and they're entirely marine. These guys have huge, epic migrations, famous migrations, where they will return to their natal breeding grounds where they were born to lay their own eggs. And many of them, it's a bit of a mystery even how they do this, but how they can find their way, years, even decades later, back to that natal colony. But they will find not only the natal colony, but the right island, but the right beach. And sometimes these are on tiny little islands, in the middle of the Atlantic or the middle of the Pacific sometimes. So it's just astonishing how they find these things. And then Dermochilidae, this is the leatherback. This is the largest of the turtles, over 2 meters long sometimes, weighing hundreds of pounds, huge turtles, and similar in that they have massive migrations and they have a strong homing sense and they can come back to their natal breeding grounds. So these are the turtles that we have in North America, and it's sadly a small group, but they're all fascinating. And it's, what I'm glad about is that we have a pretty good cross section of turtles. We've got a bunch of different types, and they're all cute. So I'm going to leave it there. This hopefully is a short little lecture on turtles, and we'll follow up shortly with the other sauropsids. Thanks for listening. All right, sorry, I have to make an edit here. So to annotate this video, just wanted to clarify that the stink pot does not, in fact, have a hinged plastron. It has a reduced plastron, which means, much like the snapping turtle, it's not able to draw its legs and head fully into its shell for protection. So, so that's just to correct something that I misspoke earlier in this video over. All right, that's it.